Mother Whitaker, please.
I didn't break the plate. The baby has been kicking all morning.
I can't keep kneeling like this. Then perhaps you should have remembered whose house you're living in. Pick up every piece and don't forget your place.
I never wanted your fortune. I only wanted to love your son and give him this child.
Love doesn't make you a Whitaker. My son deserves someone far better than you.
Enough! Mother, what have you done to my wife?
It's 2 in the morning inside the Whitaker mansion, and the rain has been falling without pause since midnight. In the kitchen, 7 months pregnant, Simone Carter kneels on the cold marble floor, gathering the last pieces of a shattered porcelain dish with her bare hands. She did not break this dish. She was told to clean it anyway, because Denise Whitaker informed the staff, in front of Simone, that if she was so eager to prove she belonged in this family, she could start by proving it on her knees. No one moved to help her. No one dared. The house is silent except for the rain against the windows and the low hum of a refrigerator down the hall, and somewhere past the staircase, a grandfather clock begins to strike 2. Simone does not cry. She stopped crying in this house 3 weeks ago. Somewhere around the night her doctor's appointment was canceled without her knowledge and replaced with one she never agreed to. She simply works, piece by piece, her fingers cold, her back aching in a way that has nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with an exhaustion she has never had a name for. She thinks of her husband, for 1,000 miles away, closing a deal that will make headlines by the end of the month, and she wonders, not for the first time, what he would do if he could see her now, on the floor of his mother's kitchen, cleaning up a mess that was never hers to clean. What Simone does not know, kneeling on that floor at 2 in the morning, is that in 6 days her husband is coming home early. Julian Whitaker will walk through the front door of this mansion with no warning to anyone, carrying a folder he was never supposed to see. And by the time the sun comes up the next morning, nothing in this house, not the staff, not the marriage, not the woman who has run this family for 30 years, will look the same again. This is where the story begins. Not at the wedding, not at the pregnancy announcement the whole family celebrated. Here, on a kitchen floor, in the rain, 6 days before everything changes. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The folder in Julian's hands did not come from his office. And it did not come from his mother either, though what is inside it will cost her more than anyone in this family could imagine. It came from a man Julian trusted enough to run his company for 11 weeks in his absence, a man who smiled at every family dinner and asked all the right questions, and who never once raised his voice, because he never needed to. By the time Julian understands what that folder means, 3 people under this roof will have already decided how far they are willing to go to protect what they believe is theirs. Only one of them is telling the truth. This is a story about a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, a mother who believed she was protecting her family, and a young woman who had already survived more in her life than anyone in that mansion ever knew. Before it ends, someone in this house will be forgiven. Someone will lose everything they spent a lifetime building. And somewhere in between, a decision made quietly, on a rainy night, over a shattered dish, will turn out to be the moment nothing could ever be undone. 6 days before that night in the kitchen, everything about this house looked different. It was a Sunday morning, and sunlight was pouring through the tall windows of the primary bedroom, the kind of light that makes even marble floors feel warm. Julian Whitaker lay beside his wife, one hand resting flat against the curve of her stomach, waiting the way he did every morning now for the baby to move. When she finally did, a small stubborn kick just under his palm, he laughed out loud, the sound filling the room in a way that made Simone forget, for a moment, that she was living in anyone's house but her own. They had already picked a name they weren't telling anyone yet, not even Denise. And they argued about it that morning the way happy couples argue, gently, with no real stakes attached. Julian wanted something classic. Simone wanted something that belonged to no one else in his family's long, engraved history. It was a small disagreement, the kind that ends in laughter rather than tension, and it was the last easy conversation they would have for a long time, though neither of them knew that yet. Outside their window, staff were already loading the last of Julian's luggage into the car that would take him to the airport. By noon, the mood in the house had changed the way weather changes, quietly, and then all at once. Julian moved through the halls giving instructions to his assistant, checking flight details, kissing his wife's forehead every time he passed her, as if he could store up enough affection in a single morning to last 11 weeks. Denise Whitaker stood near the front entrance the entire time, arms folded, watching her son prepare to leave the way she always did, with an expression that was somewhere between pride and something harder to name. She did not offer to help Simone with anything. She rarely did. At the airport, Julian held Simone's face in both hands longer than the boarding announcement allowed. He told her he would call every single day, that this deal was the last one that would ever take him away from her for this long, that 11 weeks would pass faster than either of them expected. Simone believed him, because she had no reason not to. A few feet away, Denise stood watching the two of them say goodbye the way she watched everything, carefully, almost clinically, like a woman grading a performance rather than witnessing a marriage. Simone caught her eye once and looked away first. The mansion felt different that first night without a minute. Simone had lived there for nearly a year, but she had never once been alone in it, not truly, and the size of the place seemed to double once his footsteps were gone from it. She heard sounds she had never noticed before, pipes settling, wind finding gaps in old windows, the distant closing of doors on floors she rarely visited. The staff were polite to her, as they always were, but there was a new carefulness in the way they moved around her, the kind of caution people carry when they've been warned, quietly, to keep their distance from someone. It was on the third day that Simone noticed the nursery door standing open. Julian had converted the old guest suite himself, months earlier, painting the walls a soft, warm color he'd chosen without telling her, ordering a crib from a company in Vermont because he liked the way the wood was finished. When Simone walked in that afternoon, the room was empty. The crib was gone. When she asked, one of the younger staff members told her, reluctantly, that Denise had ordered it moved to storage, explaining that the room needed to be aired out properly in case guests arrived before the baby came. Simone said nothing to Denise that day. She told herself it was a small thing, a scheduling decision, nothing worth starting a conflict over while Julian was thousands of miles away and unreachable for another 6 hours. But that night, lying alone in a bed that felt larger than it had the week before, she found herself replaying the moment the way people replay small cruelties, turning it over, looking for an explanation that made it feel less deliberate than it had seemed standing in that empty room. Isabel Reyes saw the crib being carried out to the storage building that afternoon, and she said nothing to anyone, because saying something had never once changed how things were done in that house. But she went back to her small room off the kitchen that evening and took out a notebook she had kept in the bottom of a drawer for years, one she had never shown a single person in 18 years of working for this family. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and beneath it, 3 words describing what she had watched happen to a roommate for a child who had not even been born yet. By the end of that first week alone, Simone had stopped mentioning small things to Julian on their nightly calls, telling herself each one wasn't worth the distance between them, wasn't worth making him choose between his mother and his wife from 4,000 miles away. She did not yet know that somewhere in that same week, a folder was already being prepared in an office that had nothing to do with the mansion, one that would eventually explain far more about what was happening to her than she or anyone else in that house could have guessed. 6 days had already become 5, and neither of them would slow down again. For days now stood between that house and the morning everything would change, though nothing about Simone's routine that Thursday suggested she was counting the way the story was. She spent the early afternoon on the phone with Naomi Bishop, The only person left in her life who had known her before any of this, before the wedding, before the last name that still felt borrowed some mornings. Naomi worked 12-hour shifts on a labor and delivery floor 3 hours away, and she called between patients whenever she could, because she had learned early in their friendship that Simone would rather joke about a hard week than admit to one outright. That afternoon, Simone tried the joke anyway. She told Naomi, almost laughing, that Denise had never once asked how she was feeling, only how she was holding up, as though carrying a child were an inconvenience the whole household was being asked to tolerate. Naomi did not laugh back. She had heard enough of these small jokes over the past several months to recognize the shape underneath them, and she asked, more seriously than Simone expected, whether anyone in that house had asked Simone a real question about herself in longer than she could remember answering one. Simone did not have an answer ready, and the silence on the line said more than she meant it to. She had built her entire adult life on not needing anyone to ask. She had aged out of the foster system at 18 with a duffel bag and a scholarship, no parents to call when things went wrong, no family home to retreat to on a bad week. And she had built a career instead, working her way onto construction sites where she was usually the only woman in the room and often the only person who had actually read the structural drawings. She had never needed rescuing. She had built herself. It was on one of those job sites, 5 years earlier, that she first met Julian Whitaker, though neither of them called it that at the time. He had come to inspect a property his family's company was acquiring, dressed the way men like him always dressed, expecting deference he did not ask for out loud. Simone had corrected a contractor's math in front of him within the first 10 minutes of the walkthrough, not to impress anyone, simply because the numbers were wrong and someone needed to say so. Julian had not been offended. He had been, by his own later admission, immediately interested. Their relationship had grown slowly and privately for the better part of 2 years before either of them told his family anything, largely because Julian had wanted, for once in his adult life, something that belonged entirely to him before his mother had a chance to shape it into something else. When they finally married, it was smaller than anyone in Denise Whitaker's social circle expected, and Simone had walked into that marriage believing love had been enough of a foundation to build a family on top of. She had not yet understood that in this particular family, love was rarely the only thing being measured. That same evening, in a different wing of the mansion, Denise Whitaker sat alone in the study beneath a portrait of her late husband, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her. She did not think of herself as a cruel woman, and in most rooms of her life, she was not one. But sitting there, she allowed herself to think, briefly and privately, about a woman named Vanessa Klein, someone she had not spoken of aloud in over a decade, someone who had once told this family she was carrying a child that never arrived, only a settlement that did. Vanessa had been engaged to Julian's older brother, 12 years earlier, before a car accident took him from this family entirely and left Denise to wonder, for the rest of her life, whether the stress of that pregnancy scandal had played any part in the reckless year that led to it. She had never told Julian the full story, only fragments, enough to explain why she was careful, never enough to explain why she was frightened. Sitting beneath her husband's portrait that night, watching Simone's silhouette past the study window on her way upstairs, Denise felt an old, familiar unease she had never fully put to rest. She told herself, as she had told herself for months now, that she was only protecting her son the way any mother would, and that a woman who had truly married for love would understand caution as care rather than cruelty. It was a story she had repeated to herself so many times that she had nearly convinced herself it was the only story available. She did not yet know how carefully that story was being fed to her, one small detail at a time, by someone who understood exactly which wound in this family had never fully closed, and exactly how to press on it without ever once raising his voice. 3 days remained before Julian's flight home, though the countdown belonged only to the audience of this story, because no one inside that mansion knew yet that the timeline had already begun tightening around them. That Friday, a car pulled through the gates that Simone did not recognize, and she watched from an upstairs window as a man in his early 40s stepped out, adjusting his jacket the way people do when they want to look casual without actually being casual about anything. Denise met him at the door herself, warmly, in a way she rarely greeted anyone who wasn't family. His name was Preston Cole, and Simone had met him twice before at company dinners, always briefly, always pleasantly. He was Julian's chief operating officer, the man Julian trusted enough to hand the company to for 11 weeks without a second thought, and he had a way of asking questions that felt, in the moment, like ordinary conversation. He asked Simone how she and Julian had met, how long they had dated before the wedding, when exactly she had first found out she was pregnant. She answered honestly, the way anyone would, because nothing about the questions felt like an interrogation while they were happening. It was only later, once his car had pulled back through the gates, that Denise found herself replaying those answers the way a person replays a math problem that doesn't quite add up. She did the arithmetic quietly, in her own head, comparing dates Simone had mentioned in passing months ago to the dates she had just given Preston, and she convinced herself, without ever checking a single fact against reality, that the timeline didn't match the story she had believed until now. She did not ask Simone to clarify. She simply filed the discrepancy away, the way she had once filed away every small inconsistency in Vanessa Klein's story 12 years earlier. By Saturday morning, Denise had made 2 calls without telling Simone either had happened. The first canceled Simone's prenatal appointment with the obstetrician she had chosen herself, a woman Simone trusted completely, someone who had been with her since the first ultrasound. The second scheduled a new appointment with a doctor Denise described, when Simone finally found out, as someone the family had used for years and trusted completely. Simone stood in the kitchen holding the printed confirmation for an appointment she had never agreed to, feeling something colder than anger settle into her chest, a kind of disbelief that had nowhere left to go. When she confronted Denise about it that evening, in front of 2 members of the household staff who clearly wished they were anywhere else, Denise did not apologize or explain herself the way Simone expected. Instead, she said, in a voice calm enough to sting worse than shouting would have, that she would not be made a fool of twice by a woman who had married fast and gotten pregnant faster. The staff went very still. Simone felt the words land somewhere she couldn't immediately name, and it took her a full moment to understand that Denise was not simply being difficult. She was accusing her of something. Simone called Julian that same night, her voice steadier than she felt, and told him what had happened, the canceled appointment, the strange comment, the growing sense that something in this house had shifted against her while he wasn't there to see it. Julian was exhausted on the other end of the line, still hours from closing the biggest deal of his career, and he told her, gently but distractedly, to let it go, that his mother meant well, that she was old-fashioned about these things and didn't know how to show affection any other way. It was the kindest version of the wrong answer, and Simone heard the gap open between them the moment he said it. She did not argue with him. She had learned, over the past year, that arguing with Julian about his mother from 4,000 miles away rarely changed anything except her own exhaustion by the end of the call. She told him she loved him, let him go back to his meetings, and sat alone afterward in a room she had once thought of as theirs, staring at an appointment confirmation for a doctor she had never met, scheduled by a woman who had just accused her, without saying the word outright, of trapping her son into this marriage the same way someone else once had. 2 days now remained before Julian's flight home, and the countdown that no one inside that house could feel was starting to matter more with every hour that passed. That Sunday, Denise brought in a diet plan drawn up by the doctor she had chosen without asking, insisting it be followed exactly, portion by portion, meal by meal. Simone recognized almost immediately that something about the restrictions felt wrong, tighter than anything her own doctor had ever recommended. But she had learned by now that questioning anything in this house only earned her another comment about gratitude she was supposed to be showing. She said nothing that first night, eating what was placed in front of her and going to bed hungrier than she wanted to admit to anyone, least of all herself. Isabel Reyes noticed within a day. She had watched enough dinners in that house over 18 years to recognize when a plate had been measured rather than prepared, and she began, quietly, leaving a small plate of food outside Simone's door after the kitchen had closed for the night, never mentioning it, never expecting thanks, simply making sure the young woman carrying this family's next generation did not go through the night on portions decided by someone else's fear. That same week, Denise hosted a dinner celebrating the acquisition Julian was still finalizing overseas, inviting Preston Cole and 2 members of the board to the mansion to mark the occasion properly. Simone was told, the afternoon of the dinner, that hosting would be too much stress for her condition, and that it would be better for everyone if she rested upstairs instead. She sat alone in her room that evening listening to laughter drift up from the dining room below, hearing her husband's accomplishment celebrated by people who had decided, without asking her, that she did not belong at the table where it was happening. It was 2 nights later, exhausted and lightheaded from a week of restricted meals and sleepless nights, that Simone nearly lost her footing on the main staircase, catching the railing at the last possible second, her heart pounding harder than the moment itself seemed to justify. Denise happened to be crossing the hall when it occurred, and her first words, before she asked whether Simone was hurt, were a sharp comment about the marble underfoot and whether anything had been scratched. Isabel, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw the whole exchange and said nothing out loud, though her hand tightened around the notebook she now carried with her most days. Naomi Bishop had been growing more worried by the day, ever since a phone call 2 nights earlier in which Simone's voice had cracked in a way it never had before, even during the hardest years either of them could remember. She left her shift early that Tuesday and drove 3 hours without telling Simone she was coming, wanting to see her friend's face rather than trust another phone call to tell her the truth. She was stopped at the gate before she ever reached the door, told by security, on Denise's instruction, that Simone wasn't seeing visitors that day, a decision made entirely without Simone's knowledge or consent. Simone found out about Naomi's visit only after the fact, from a staff member too uneasy to keep quiet about it any longer, and something in her cracked quietly that night in a way none of the earlier cruelties had managed to reach. She had endured the canceled appointment, the missing crib, the whispered accusation about her marriage, but the thought of her oldest friend turned away at a gate, 3 hours of driving undone by a single sentence from someone who had no right to make that decision, felt like the first cruelty aimed not at her pride, but at the last thread connecting her to a life outside this house. She tried calling Julian that night and reached only his voicemail, his assistant's automated message explaining he was in back-to-back sessions finalizing signatures on the deal. What Simone did not know, and would not learn for several more days, was that Preston Cole had spent the better part of that week quietly managing which messages reached Julian during the final stretch of negotiations, flagging her calls as personal matters that could wait, keeping her voice from reaching her husband at precisely the moments she needed him to hear it most. Somewhere in an office thousands of miles from that mansion, a decision was being made about her marriage that she had no part in and no knowledge of at all. One day now remained before Julian's flight home, though by this point the countdown had stopped feeling like anything Simone could take comfort in. It was Isabel Reyes who finally broke 18 years of careful silence, waiting until the house had gone quiet that night before knocking softly on Simone's door and asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether she might come in for a moment. She was carrying the notebook she had kept hidden in her drawer for weeks, the one with dates and small observations recorded in careful handwriting, and she set it on the bed without explanation, letting Simone read it herself. Simone read through pages that confirmed everything she had already lived through and several things she had not known at all. The missing crib recorded by date. The canceled appointment noted the same afternoon it happened. The turned-away visitor logged with a timestamp beside it. Near the last entry, Isabel had written something else entirely. Something she had seen weeks earlier and not understood the significance of until now. She had watched Preston Cole, during one of his visits, sitting at Julian's assistant's laptop in the study for several minutes longer than any errand should have required, closing the screen quickly when he heard footsteps approaching. Simone sat with that page for a long time, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone looking for what's underneath. She did not yet understand what Preston might have been doing, but she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything Denise had said or done, that the cruelty in this house might not be isolated after all, that something larger might be moving beneath the surface of her marriage that had nothing to do with grief over a woman named Vanessa and everything to do with a company worth more than most people could imagine. That night, lying awake long after Isabel had gone back to her room, Simone faced a choice she had been avoiding for weeks without admitting it to herself in those terms. She could stay, enduring whatever came next, trusting that Julian would come home in a matter of hours, and that the truth, once spoken aloud, would be enough to fix what had broken while he was away. Or she could leave, tonight, at 7 months pregnant, with no parents to call and no family home to retreat to, carrying only what fit in a single bag, and a fear she had never let herself feel this fully before. She packed slowly, folding clothes she barely registered choosing, telling herself with each item that she was simply being careful, not that she had already decided. By midnight she was standing at the edge of the property, the gate visible through the dark ahead of her, her bag heavy on one shoulder, and her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the distance she still had to walk. She made it almost to the gate itself before a sharp, unfamiliar tightening low in her stomach stopped her completely, her breath catching, one hand flying instinctively to the curve beneath her coat. She stood frozen for several long seconds, terrified it was the beginning of something the doctors had warned her about. Something too early and too dangerous to face alone on a dark road with no car and no one nearby who knew her name. She called Naomi with shaking hands, and her friend picked up on the second ring, 3 hours away but talking her through every breath as though she were standing right beside her, asking careful questions, counting seconds between the tightening, until slowly, gradually, it eased and did not return. It had been fear more than labor, though the fear itself had nearly cost her everything. Naomi made her promise, voice firm in a way Simone had rarely heard from her, that she would not attempt to leave that house alone in this condition again, not at midnight, not on foot, not without someone who could reach her in minutes rather than hours. Simone agreed, shaken and ashamed of how close she had come to a decision that might have endangered far more than her pride. But lying awake afterward, the notebook still open on the bed beside her, she found a different kind of resolve settling into the space where panic had been. If Julian would not hear the truth from her voice alone, she would make certain he could not look away from the evidence itself. She began that same night, recording herself quietly on her phone, dates and details spoken aloud the way Isabel had written them down, adding what she knew now that even Isabel didn't, that a folder existed somewhere containing whatever Preston Cole had been doing on that laptop, and that her husband was flying home in a matter of hours to a house that had been quietly rearranging itself against her for weeks. She did not know yet that Julian was already reading messages he had never been meant to see, 3 time zones away, in the last hours before his flight, or that the choice she had almost made at that gate would soon be overtaken entirely by a truth about to break far bigger than either of them. Somewhere over the Atlantic, in the final hours before his flight touched down, Julian Whitaker sat with his laptop open for the first time in days without an assistant hovering nearby to manage what crossed his screen. The deal had closed that morning, hours ahead of schedule, and with the pressure finally lifted, he found himself scrolling through a backlog of messages his assistant had been quietly triaging on his behalf for weeks. The kind of unglamorous inbox work no one thinks to mention until it matters. Near the bottom of an unread folder, he found 3 voicemails from Simone he had never once heard ring through. He played them in order, and the voice coming through his headphones sounded nothing like the wife he had kissed goodbye at the airport 11 weeks earlier. The first was tired. The second was quieter, almost apologetic. The way people sound when they've convinced themselves their pain is an inconvenience to someone else's schedule. The third had been recorded the same night she nearly reached the front gate, and in it, her voice cracked in a way Julian had never heard from her in 5 years of knowing her, describing a fear too large for the words she was using to hold it. He sat frozen in his seat for a long moment, the cabin noise fading around him, understanding for the first time that his wife had been trying to reach him and failing for longer than he had any idea of. He scrolled further, hands moving faster now, and found something else entirely, a document that should never have ended up in this particular folder, a draft memo written in Preston Cole's own careful phrasing, prepared for the board and never meant to reach Julian at all before its intended presentation. The memo laid out a timeline titled Family Instability, built from selective details about Julian's marriage, the speed of the wedding, the timing of the pregnancy, phrased with just enough calculated concern to suggest that Julian was too emotionally compromised by a young, unsettled home life to be trusted with sole control of the newly merged company. Reading it, Julian understood in a single, sickening moment that the questions Preston had asked Simone weeks earlier, the ones that had seemed like ordinary small talk at a family dinner, had never been small talk at all. They had been reconnaissance, gathered specifically to build this exact document. Every version of the past 11 weeks rearranged itself in his mind at once. His mother's suspicion had not simply appeared on its own. It had been fed to her, carefully, by someone who understood precisely which decade-old wound in this family had never fully closed and exactly how to press against it without ever raising his voice or drawing suspicion to himself. Denise had not manufactured her fear out of nothing. She had been handed a story engineered to match the shape of her worst memory, and she had believed it because the man delivering it had never once given her a reason to doubt him. Julian did not call his mother from the plane, and he did not call Simone either, unwilling to say anything until he understood the full shape of what he was walking into. He requested the flight crew move his connection up by 2 hours, and he sat afterward with his phone in his lap, replaying the third voicemail one more time, listening to his wife's voice break on a night he had not been there to hear it happen. Somewhere below him, thousands of feet down, a house was still turning quietly against the one person in it who had never once been given the whole truth about anything happening inside it. He landed a little after midnight, refusing the car his assistant had arranged, driving himself instead through rain that had not let up in hours, the same storm that had been falling over the mansion since well before dark. He thought, driving, of the morning he had left, sunlight through the bedroom window, his hand against Simone's stomach, an argument over a name that had ended in laughter rather than tension. It felt, now, like it belonged to a different marriage entirely, one that existed before he had understood how completely it had been undermined while he was 3 continents away trusting the wrong people to protect it. The gates of the mansion came into view a little after 2 in the morning, exactly as the story had promised from its very first moment. Julian pulled through them without slowing for the guard station, past the fountain, up the long drive toward a house with only a single light still burning, low and yellow, coming from the kitchen windows at the back. He did not yet know what he would find behind that door. He only knew, gripping the wheel with both hands, that whatever it was, he was finally close enough to see it for himself. 6 days exactly from the morning he had said goodbye at that airport gate. Julian pushed through the back door without knocking, rain soaking through his shirt, and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen exactly the way the story had promised he would. Simone knelt on the floor in the same spot she had knelt in for the better part of an hour, gathering the last pieces of a dish she had not broken, her hands raw from the cold marble, her face turned toward the sound of the door before she had time to arrange it into anything other than what it actually was. For a long moment neither of them said a single word. He crossed the room and knelt down in front of her before she could stand, taking her hands gently away from the broken porcelain, turning them over in his own as though checking for damage he could actually see. Up close, in the low kitchen light, he could see what 11 weeks and 3 unheard voicemails had not fully prepared him for. The exhaustion carved into her face, the way her shoulders had learned to brace before anyone even spoke to her. He asked her, very quietly, how long this had been happening, and Simone, who had rehearsed a dozen calmer versions of this answer in her head, simply told him the truth instead. She did not soften it for him the way she had softened every phone call over the past 11 weeks. She told him about the crib, the canceled appointment, the diet plan, the dinner she had not been allowed to attend. Naomi turned away at the gate without her knowledge. The accusation Denise had made about the timeline of their marriage in front of 2 members of the staff. Julian listened without interrupting once, his jaw tightening further with every detail. And when she finished, he did not offer an apology that could possibly match what she had just described. He simply asked her where his mother was. Denise was still awake, sitting in the study beneath her late husband's portrait, and she looked up when Julian appeared in the doorway soaked to the shoulders, understanding immediately from his expression that he already knew more than she had prepared herself to explain. He did not raise his voice, which frightened her considerably more than shouting would have. He asked her, in a tone she had never once heard from him in 30 years, whether she had asked Simone, even a single time in 11 weeks, how she was actually feeling, or only ever how she was behaving. Denise opened her mouth to answer the way she had answered every difficult question in her life, with composure and control, and found, for the first time and longer than she could remember, that neither was available to her. She looked at her son standing in the doorway with rain still dripping from his sleeves, and understood that whatever careful version of events she had been constructing for months would not survive this conversation intact. She told him, instead, the truth she had never once spoken aloud to him in 12 years, about a woman named Vanessa Klein, about his brother, about a settlement and a pregnancy that never arrived, and a fear she had carried alone ever since without ever giving it a proper name. She told him how Preston Cole's questions to Simone weeks earlier had matched, almost exactly, the shape of doubts she had never fully resolved from that older wound, and how she had let herself believe, without checking a single fact, that history was repeating itself in front of her. It was not an excuse, and she did not offer it as one. It was simply the truth she had been too proud and too frightened to give her son for over a decade, and hearing it finally, Julian understood that his mother's cruelty had not come from nowhere, even as he understood that understanding where it came from did not undo a single thing it had cost his wife. He told her plainly that explaining a wound did not excuse what she had done with it, and that whatever came next between them would depend entirely on what she chose to do from this point forward rather than anything she had already done. Denise did not argue. For the first time and longer than either of them could remember, she simply nodded, and let the silence between them sit exactly as heavy as it had earned the right to be. Somewhere upstairs, Simone was finally being helped into a warm bed by Isabel Reyes. And somewhere across the ocean, in an office that did not yet know its own plans had already been discovered, Preston Cole was still congratulating himself on a memo he believed no one else had ever read. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Whitaker Global filled slowly the next morning, executives and directors settling into chairs still unaware of why an emergency session had been called less than 12 hours after Julian's flight landed. Preston Cole arrived exactly on time, as he always did, greeting people by name, asking after their families, performing the same easy warmth that had carried him through every room in this building for years. He took his usual seat near the head of the table, 3 chairs down from where Julian normally sat, and noticed, a moment too late, that Julian was already there ahead of him. Julian did not open with accusations. He opened by placing a single printed page in the center of the table, turned so everyone could read it, the memo titled Family Instability and Preston's own careful handwriting notes along the margin. He watched Preston's face while the rest of the room read it, watched the practiced warmth hold for exactly as long as it took the room to understand what the document actually contained, and watched it finally crack, just slightly, once 2 board members looked up from the page and then directly at him instead. Preston tried composure first, calling it a preliminary draft taken out of context, a normal part of contingency planning any responsible executive prepared for. Julian let him finish, then placed a second page beside the first, a timeline built from Isabel's notebook and Simone's own recorded voice memos, showing dates that lined up precisely with visits Preston had made to the mansion, questions he had asked Simone directly, and a laptop he had been seen sitting at longer than any errand required. The room went very quiet. Composure, it turned out, only holds up as long as the story underneath it does. By the time the vote came, it was less a deliberation than a formality, the board moving swiftly to remove Preston from his position and from any future claim to leadership he had spent years quietly building toward. He left the building that afternoon without the calm he had walked in with, and the story that followed him afterward, in the industry that had once respected him, was not one he ever fully recovered from. Manipulating a grieving mother's old wound to destabilize a family and seize a company came, in the end, at a cost considerably higher than the leverage it was meant to buy him. Back at the mansion that same evening, Simone sat alone with Denise for the first time since Julian had come home, choosing the conversation herself rather than waiting for one to be arranged around her. She did not ask for an apology. The one had already been offered clumsily days earlier. She asked instead whether Denise could ever see her as family rather than as a threat to be managed, a question far harder to answer honestly than any apology would have required. Denise did not answer quickly, and to her credit, she did not pretend the answer was simple. She said only that she wanted to try, and that trying, this time, would have to be enough to start with. 6 weeks passed before the story reached the moment it had been building toward from its very first scene, though those 6 weeks were not the dramatic kind that make for easy telling. They were smaller than that, quieter, made up of things as ordinary as Denise knocking before entering a room for the first time in months, or Simone finding herself, gradually, less braced when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Trust, once broken this thoroughly, does not return all at once. It returns the way light returns after a storm, unevenly, one window at a time, with no guarantee that every room gets it back equally or on the same schedule. Simone went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks earlier than expected, but healthy in every way that mattered, and Julian drove her to the hospital himself, refusing every offer of a car and driver the way he had refused one the night he flew home. Naomi arrived within the hour, still in scrubs from her own shift, and Isabel Reyes came not long after, standing quietly in the hallway outside the delivery room because she had not been invited inside and would never have presumed to ask. It was Simone who sent word out to bring her in, understanding by then exactly who deserved to be present for this. The baby was a girl, born just after midnight, and the first sound she made in the world filled a small hospital room with the kind of noise that erases, at least for a moment, everything that came before it. Julian held his daughter first, then Simone, then, at Simone's own quiet insistence, Naomi, who had spent a decade catching other people's babies and had never expected to be handed one that mattered this much to her personally. Isabel stood near the window, saying nothing, though the notebook she had once kept out of necessity had long since become something closer to a keepsake than a record of harm. Denise arrived the next morning, later than she might have in an earlier version of this story, having waited deliberately so the room would not feel crowded with her presence before Simone was ready for it. She did not reach for the baby the way she once might have, assuming a grandmother's right to it. She asked instead, standing carefully at a respectful distance from the bed, whether she might hold her granddaughter, phrasing it as a request rather than an entitlement for what may have been the first time in her entire adult life. Simone looked at her for a long moment before answering, and then nodded, and Denise's hands, when they finally reached out, were noticeably unsteady. It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened in the months before it. A woman who had once decided, without asking, that a nursery needed airing out and a marriage needed investigating, now stood waiting for permission she had no automatic right to, and receiving it not because she had earned back everything at once, but because she had finally started asking the right questions instead of assuming the answers. Redemption, in this house, was turning out to be something closer to a practice than a single act, repeated daily rather than declared once and considered finished. Months later, the old nursery stood finished at last, rebuilt not to Julian's original vision, but to a new one Simone had designed herself, room by room, choosing every detail the way she had once chosen calculations on a job site, with quiet, exacting care. Isabel helped hang the final picture frame the afternoon it was completed, standing on a step stool, while Simone held it level from below, the two of them laughing about something neither of them would bother repeating to anyone else later. Julian watched from the doorway, his daughter asleep against his shoulder, and did not say anything at all, because for once, nothing needed explaining. 6 days had once stood between a rainy kitchen floor and everything changing in this house, and it is worth remembering, now, that the door Julian walked through that night did not simply bring him home. It brought him back to a version of his family that had nearly finished rearranging itself without him, and it gave him, just in time, the chance to decide what kind of home he actually wanted to walk back into. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again the way they were before. This was one of them, and everyone still living behind it, in the end, was better for having walked through it honestly at last.